Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It's Thursday, June 26, 2025, and on Thursdays we talk about knowledge and science. Today we're talking about science and climate change in relation to peace. Peace comes a little bit later in this discussion, but I think it'll make sense. Bear with me. So the most comprehensive studies of climate science have found that well over 90% of climate experts agree that there's an anthropogenic global warming impact that's real and quite substantial. In fact, of the more than 150 independently confirmed climate experts that have been studied, in North America at least, some 98.7% indicated that the Earth's getting warmer, at least in large measure, in part because of human activities such as burning fossil fuels. And of course, there are many other contributing factors as well. But among those who have the highest level of expertise, at least as measured by the most numbers of scientific publications in their respective subdisciplines, there was 100% agreement now that the Earth's warming, again, at least in part, or many would say even mainly due to human activities. And then in addition, the meta-studies of the most rigorous climate science research determined that over 99% of the climate science studies within the past decade have confirmed that climate change is real, measurable, and significant. The authors of the biggest study that I've seen, the most comprehensive study, conclude the following. Our results confirm, like countless previous studies, that there's no significant scientific debate amongst experts about whether or not climate change is human-caused. This issue has been comprehensively settled, and the reality is no more in contention among scientists than is plate tectonics. End quote. And that kind of level of agreement almost never happens in science. Now, just because there's a near consensus among scientists, however, that doesn't mean that everyone necessarily believes in climate science or climate change. In fact, not everyone agrees on the facts. And most importantly, we have to realize the fallacy of that common trope. We just let the facts speak for themselves, because that's patently false. So in other words, the facts never speak for themselves. We always speak for the facts. We identify and label information as facts, and then we interpret and communicate those facts in different ways. And all that said, there is still a growing consensus worldwide that climate change is real, and that the clear majority of peoples around the different countries of the world actually believe in human-created climate change. In a newly published study in Scientific Advances, researchers surveyed almost 60,000 people across 63 different countries, and belief in climate change was at 86%. So here, belief, what they meant by belief, it was measured based on answers to questions about whether action was necessary to avoid global catastrophe, whether humans were causing climate change, whether it was a serious threat to humanity. And the evidence showed that an overwhelming majority then think that climate change is indeed a serious threat and that humans are one of the major causes. And over time, concern about climate change has risen internationally, as shown by separate Pew Research Center polls across a couple dozen countries in 2022. So in other words, people in most advanced economies expressed high levels, not consensus, but very high levels of concern, and higher levels of concern typically than U.S. citizens by comparison. So for example, over 80% of French adults and about 3/4 of Germans describe climate change as a major threat. In the U.S., the figures are closer to around 70% who believe that climate change is real, but only 3 in 5 think that humans are a major cause. And in fact, a 2023 study of U.S. adults found only a slight majority of U.S. adults, 54%, described climate change as a major threat to the country's well-being. That included, perhaps not surprisingly, about 78% of the Democrats who were surveyed, and only about 1 in 4, just under 1 in 4 Republicans who consider climate change to be a major threat. So there seems to be something of a political component to this, but let me be clear. You can still believe that climate change is real and yet not view it as a major threat. So these are kind of two different, related, but different issues. But there's also quite a crucial question here, and that is, why don't people then believe in climate change? Or what explains why people might be skeptical about climate change or the science and so on? And what does any of this have to do with peace, Dr. J? I'll get to that. First, people have different understandings about the nature of science. Some people know very little about science. In fact, one of the things that I've often disliked or that disturbs me about my own university is that you can actually get a liberal arts degree without ever taking any natural science courses, and certainly without setting foot in a lab and so on. But that's another story for another day. But there's also an interesting distinction, too, between people who view science as the, quote, search for truth versus those who view science as basically one big debate. And one study showed that people were more likely to believe in anthropogenic climate change, that is, again, human-driven, if they view science as a search for truth rather than just a debate. And then, in addition, I should mention too, it gets even more interesting if you look into the social and the demographic and the psychological or cultural aspects about beliefs regarding climate change. So again, another meta-analysis. And remember, I've talked about this before. Remember, meta-analyses are summaries of dozens or even at times hundreds of different studies to come up with what are the common findings and so on. So there was one meta-analysis by Hornsey et al. That concluded that age, gender, income, race, and education are all significant demographic predictors of climate change denial. Okay, so in other words, the empirical findings suggest that older white men with lower incomes and less formal education are more inclined to deny climate change compared to their demographic counterparts, the other categories. And of course, as I've just mentioned a moment ago, there's politics involved here too. So liberals and left-wing voters display less skepticism towards the scientific consensus on climate change compared to those who have right-wing perspectives, but also from a personality standpoint, who are measurably more authoritarian in their orientations, more conservative in their politics, and more inclined to a free market type of ideology. And then, again, we can add a little bit more nuance to that particular debate as well. So researchers found that individuals are also more likely to deny climate change when the related or proposed policy solutions to climate change happen to contradict their ideological beliefs. We don't like to be wrong, and we don't like to have our ideological positions compromised in any fundamental ways. On the other hand, those who know or learn about the scientific consensus on climate change are more likely then to believe in climate change. And additionally, individuals who trust and value the scientific disciplines also tend to trust the scientific consensus on climate change more. And then, again, I mentioned personality issues just briefly. So consider a national study of 1,725 voting age Canadians. The researchers were studying then the relationship between general personality traits and antagonistic traits in relation to climate skepticism. And after controlling for the various demographic factors, researchers found that there are personality traits that are actually linked to climate change or skepticism thereon. In terms of the general traits, researchers found that openness, that is curiosity, imaginativeness, agreeableness, kindness and warmth, emotionality, that is worry and empathy for others, and honesty and humility, including sincerity and fairness. All of these were negatively related to climate denial or climate skepticism. And these are also the people who tend to be more supportive of the science and more likely then to believe in climate change. On the other hand, people who lean hard right politically were more likely to express climate change skepticism, but also people who scored higher on measures of narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism, or that high self-interest, are also more likely to be climate change deniers. And then it goes even further. Another series of studies across several countries determined that national narcissism is also a strong predictor of general science denial and specifically of denial of climate change. So, in other words, basically, if you define yourself in terms of your broader national identity and commitments and have that sort of strident sense of nationalism, you start to suspend rationality in favor of the collectively shared beliefs. And guess who tends to be most nationally narcissistic? Your elected representatives, as you might expect. We kind of want them to be, right, at some level. We tend to vote for people who will put their constituents' interests above all others. And of course, at the national level, that means putting our national interests first as well. But that can lead to problems. So consider the composition of Congress. There were 139 elected officials in the 117th Congress in the United States. They were sitting in 2021, including, this is again a formal study that was done in this regard, and that included 109 House representatives, which is about 25% of all House reps, and 30 of the senators, which would be 30%, 30 out of 100. And in other words, over 1/4 of the Congress then, quote, refused to acknowledge the scientific evidence of human-caused climate change. So, as much as the scientists were in agreement, you could see that that didn't translate necessarily into full political support for the global or the scientific information and data about climate change. And then beliefs about climate change are reinforced further through our, as you almost certainly know, through our media habits, our social media habits. So again, a U.S. national study determined that people who obtain most of their information from Fox News or far-right or Christian or alt-health media outlets are more skeptical of climate change than everyone else, or compared to their counterparts who get their news from other sources, whether it be from nonpartisan or middle-of-the-road sources or left-leaning sources. And in addition, we also tend to pay less attention to the news that makes us, or that the information that challenges our preconceived notions and worldviews. So again, another study determined that the more specific facts that were highlighted with respect to climate change, those who had a more liberal orientation then were more likely to sign a petition or to donate to a cause compared to those who had a more conservative orientation. And when they were given very specific facts or the same facts that were highlighting unequivocally the importance of climate change, they were actually less likely to sign a petition or donate to combat climate change. So again, whatever the facts are, however they're presented to us, can have a direct impact on how we then respond ourselves. And then finally, as a sociologist, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about at the institutional, right, at the macro level, shall we say. Because at the broadest level, there are so many different corporate actors who are climate change skeptics or deniers, typically if they're in fields or in areas that have a financial stake in maintaining the status quo or the current system. And it's a lot like how the cigarette companies back in the day actively resisted and undermined and didn't report on the best science available that was linking smoking, for example, to cancer. And those corporate sectors and the companies and their lobbyists are big funders of politicians who are then paid to support their agendas, especially in the United States. And that's typically what we see, again, if you're looking particularly at the U.S. Congress, just mentioned a moment ago as well. And so in general then, but how does any of this then relate back to peace? Well, so much of climate change is driven by our actions, so the actions of human beings, and especially in the aggregate or at the national levels, okay? And if that's the case, we're inclined to do what in terms of our own personal group interest or our national interests? Well, every country wants to protect their population, at least generically speaking, but especially in terms of energy and food production and transportation and daily living environments for that matter. And all of these things are crucial in terms of their implications for climate change. And then what happens, especially if we're competing for scarce resources? Well, things can get quite heated, no pun intended, or contentious. And in many cases, we end up fighting others over land claims, over resources that we think that we're entitled to, and so on. And of course, that's not the only cause, but it's a major threat to peace. So if we then have scientific superiority in terms of our weaponry, that gives us yet another advantage too. And there are many corporate actors then who also benefit from the military-industrial complex, who benefit from developing technologies that we can then use and, if necessary, weaponize to exploit others in conflicts, and so on. So there's a connection then between national interests and borders and ethnic groups and their control over resources and our likelihood of going to war over these issues. And so even if you want to live the rest of your life denying that climate change is real or any evidence, you're going to see some immediate effects, not just in terms of weather patterns or your local environments, but also you're going to see millions of people engaging in mass migrations. That process has already started, of course. And nations spending more and more of their resources, of their tax dollars, as it were, to secure their borders. And there are going to be ongoing disputes about immigrant levels and about refugees and so on. And how do we then secure our borders and protect our kind? And of course, the broader issues around continually fighting to secure key resources, especially of the non-renewable types. But all that said, there's a silver lining. It's mainly to be found, actually, in the scientific community. And the many scientists all over the world who, regardless of their culture, their languages, their national identities, they're out there measuring and monitoring and evaluating the evidence and seeing in almost as a consensus, as I've mentioned, they're seeing the same patterns and the same mechanisms at play. As I say, there's this emerging consensus. And so while there's obviously a competitive aspect to to science and scientific discovery, there's probably more cooperation and more of a sense of shared values and understanding across the global scientific community than just about any other community that I can even imagine. And so if we do our job well, we can be a model of knowledge and understanding and cooperation that peoples everywhere can appreciate. So part of that too also requires that we do a better job of communicating and breaking down the silos, and especially with respect to the corporate and political opposition that inevitably we're going to encounter. So findings also indicate then that communicating higher levels of consensus increases perceptions of scientific certainty. So where we have really good knowledge, we have to do a better job of sharing where those consensus, whatever the consensus might be, whatever the specific issue, we have to do a better job of communicating that. Okay? And then when we achieve greater scientific certainty and agreement, that tends to be associated again with positive changes, greater likelihood of personal agreement and policy supports for non-political issues relating to science and relating to global climate. Okay, and then finally, I think we have to regain and restore our trust in science, and that requires introducing youngsters, in my view, to scientific thinking from the earliest ages, just like learning a new language or music. The earlier the better. In fact, if I were in charge, and I never will be, of course, I'd make sure that every school-age child would not only start with reading and writing and arithmetic, the basics, as they say, but I'd also recommend, or I'd make sure that every kid, at least in the schools that I was creating, had regular early exposure to a second language, more language training, classes in music and the arts on a daily basis, and science, natural science, right from the outset. So, but you're probably not a child, especially if you're listening to or watching this vlog. So my advice to you is that if you're watching or listening, don't take for granted what you think you know. Challenge yourself to always continue to look and listen and learn and read from the best scientific sources possible. You'll always want to be acquiring the best and the newest information about whatever the scientific issues are that interest you, including climate change and global warming and these sorts of things. I do this on a regular basis. It's part of my religion, shall we say. So that's why I am a regular subscriber to magazines like Scientific American and Nature. I want to read and stay abreast of what's happening. Doesn't mean I understand everything by any stretch. I'm just continually trying to learn and keep up with the latest kind of broad knowledge in these areas. So look for the best data is what I'm recommending. Look at the most unbiased and nonpartisan sources that possible are available, and approach the issues just as you would if you were learning a new language or learning to play an instrument, what have you, okay? With openness and with energy and with excitement to learn as much as you can. Be willing to learn and understand things that you didn't understand previously, that you didn't know before, every day. Again, personally, I still love the idea of learning. I love the idea of having those aha moments every time I finally understand something that I was struggling with previously, or that I just simply didn't know about previously. Or someone just explained something to me in a way that I could understand that I hadn't understood previously. And I hope you do that occasionally as well. Or I hope that the Dr. J Vlog series can do that for you as well, at least on occasion, for some of you. All right, well, that's it for today. As ever, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. And hopefully we'll see you for Friday's vlog, looking at human behavior and justifications in relation to peace. All right, see you then.